Hello and welcome to the very sad, last and final episode
The last one.
of Max and Vito's 8-push journey. Just got something in my eye.
Is that
today
a
we'll
tear?
be talking, I think it is.
Those are
Today
tears.
we'll be talking about Units 8 from 1945 through 1980 and Units 9, 1980 through now. I will be talking about 1980 and my good friend here, Vito, will be talking about Unit 8. I'll be talking about Unit 9. Vito, begin.
Unit 8, 1945 to 1980. With the end of World War II, economic growth followed, and the passage of the GI Bill, which provided service that access, education, and affordable housing for veterans. This led to a baby boom and the creation of the proverbial Sun Belt as a center as the U.S. population shifted south. Now, America was an interesting period in this time because it was like the 1920s with all the economic prosperity and consumerism, but America was surprisingly conservative. And they elected in the 1953 election Republican Dwight David Eisenhower, and he defined at the end of an era for Democrat prosperity. And Eisenhower's policies included the National System of Interstate Highways Act, which had the purpose of creating more accessible systems of road travel. In the post-war era, redressed the values of American dream with the creation of pervasive spread of suburbs, which originated from the first Levitt towns that were developed because of the fast assemblage of camps in World War II, which influenced mass-produced homes that were affordable to the average people. Television also gained prominence during the diffusion of popular culture with entertainment and new music like rock and politics. The 1950s also created an era of counterculture despite the conformity in American picket fence, which was the Beat Generation, which criticized and challenged this era of conformity. The post-war era also saw the initiation of Cold War tensions between America and Russia. And Russia and America joined NATO and UN, which completed the era of U.S.'s abandonment policy of isolationism, and instead it was replaced by a policy of containment, which George Kennan's long telegram advocated for. Policies rooted in containment were the Truman Doctrine, which proved successful in preventing communism in Turkey and Greece. Another policy was the Marshall Plan, in which provided aid to rebuild the aftermath of the disaster from the war in Western Europe. Containment was also practiced in the proxy wars of Korea and Vietnam, with indirect engagement of warfare between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. Though the Korean War ended in an armistice, and it was rendered as a success produced by containment. The Cold War policies in the Truman era were reflected by Eisenhower's presidency. The Eisenhower Doctrine provided aid for military strength in Eastern Europe, countries that loomed in the threat of communism. Following the Korean War, Cuba fell under communism with the rule of Fidel Castro. Due to the proximal distance Cuba had to the United States, this proved a strategic threat to Russia, from Russia to the United States. And with the Kennedy administration emerging in the early 60s, taking note of the devastating failure that was the Bay of Pigs invasion of 1961, which was the year my dad was born, potential threats of nuclear war grew between two global superpowers, the USSR and the US, during the Cuban Missile Crisis. The policies of anti-communism had diffused into American public, creating the Red Scare. This creation of fallout shelters and drills to prepare for nuclear attacks. The Red Scare was headed by Senator Joseph McCarthy, who led attacks against suspected communists. These actions would later be known as McCarthyism. During the Cold War, America also invested heavily in defense arms in the Army in the arms race, and also invested heavily in space exploration during the space race. Now, the civil rights movement were very important. They gained traction in the 1950s into the 1960s. A notable case during this era was the civil rights movement. For the civil rights movement was the Brown versus Board of Education that ended as a victory to ending segregation of schooling, but was met with severe opposition upon its implementation. And the Little Rock Nine were notable victims to the hostility shown in the oppression against the Supreme Court ruling. The civil rights movement could be characterized by the practice of civil disobedience, which was nonviolent disobedience to laws that were found by individuals or groups to be unjust. One notable example of civil disobedience practice was the civil rights movement was Rosa Parks, an African-American woman's refusal to give up her bus seat because of her race. A key figure in the civil rights movement was Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. influenced by Gandhi's peaceful protests, which were expressed in a letter written from a Birmingham jail cell. He would deliver the famous "I Have a Dream" speech in 1963 on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. However, the movement opposed to nonviolent methods for protest of racial equality, unlike the Black Panther Party and the Nation of Islam. And these violent groups had a different approach than what Martin Luther King suggested, but ultimately the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was a hallmark for the civil rights effort that outlawed any form of discrimination based upon race, sex, and religion and country of natural origin. The Voting Rights Act of 1964 and the 24th Amendment helped these efforts of civil rights in the United States as well. But this did not continue with the War on Poverty, as Lyndon B. Johnson acquired a significant legislation to help impoverished groups because he remembered about his poor upbringing in Texas and educating poor kids as a school teacher. And these legislations included reforms of healthcare, Medicare, and Medicaid, the Education and Department of Housing and Urban Development. These reforms legislations were coined as the Great Society. But though, as problems still increase, another proxy war happens, the Vietnam War. President Auer likened the communist conflict as a domino theory, suggests if that Vietnam were to fall to communism, so were the other countries in Asia. And with the continued rising tensions in Vietnam under the Kennedy administration, President Kennedy attempted to avoid involvement. Following President Kennedy's assassination, America joined the South Vietnamese side of the Vietnam War, citing the Gulf of Tonkin incident as the reason to fight for their cause. The involvement in the war was allowed thanks to the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, which provided President Johnson to send troops to Vietnam. The draft lottery was implemented, which was met with significant criticism due to counterculture movements. With Vietnam being the first televised war, the Tet Offensive, which was televised against the United States in South Vietnam, stirred up public distrust in the war effort. This trust was further ensued when President Johnson's Pentagon Papers were released in 1971, which exemplified lying from the government to the public on the war. And this trust in the government helped elect Richard Nixon, the Republican, to presidency in 1968 because of his support of the Vietnamization policy, which entailed the gradual removal of U.S. troops from Vietnam. He acted upon the policy in his presidency in 1973, announced peace by signing the Paris Accords, ultimately ending the war in Vietnam. So now we're going to move on to day-to-day. President Nixon and his Secretary of State, Henry Kissinger, accomplished diplomatic relations with China and the Soviet Union through a détente in order to ease Cold War tensions. An important example of this was the Anti-Ballistic Missiles Treaty and Strategic Arms Limitation in 1972, which aimed to limit nuclear weapon arsenals of both countries. Nixon's visit to China created trade and communication with China. During Nixon's presidency, the Arab-Israeli War occurred, and the U.S. took sides with Israel, which hired gas prices because most of the U.S.'s oil came from Arabia, and OPEC placed an embargo on the U.S. in 1973 because of this. Nixon's second presidential term ended because of his resignation in 1974 due to the Watergate scandal, which involved an illegal break-in of the Democratic National Committee headquarters conspired against the Nixon administration and was discovered by Forrest Gump, according to the movie. But Nixon's vice president, Gerald Ford, succeeded him, but he faced controversy after pardoning Nixon because he wanted to see Nixon's face punity for his crimes. In 1975, the fall of Saigon proved a Pyrrhic victory for communism. President Ford's attempts to combat inflation with his whip inflation campaign, which ultimately was unsuccessful. Ford's re-election was also unsuccessful, and Democrat Jimmy Carter was elected president in 1976. President Carter only served one term because his tenure was characterized with inflation, high employment rates, and oil shortages. However, he's most notably received accolades for his Camp David Accords, which was an agreement between Israel and Egypt. And the Iranian hostage crisis was poorly handled under the Carter administration, as 52 Americans were held hostage at a U.S. embassy in Tehran, Iran, and this led to the election of Ronald Reagan against Jimmy Carter. Max.
And now we're on to Unit 9. 1980 to the present. Newly President Ronald Reagan promised an America that would thrive on conservative policies. Groups like the Moral Majority, composed of evangelical Christians, contributed to his vote. Reagan's economic policy of Reaganomics entailed providing the wealthy tax cuts that would help promote investments and trickle down the classes to increase income. The results of Reaganomics were debated to have worked, but increased wealth disparity and contributed to the nation debt. Within a week in office, Reagan released the 52 hostages in the Iranian hostage crisis. Reagan did this by illegally selling arms to Iran in exchange for the hostages, and the money the U.S. earned from the exchange would be hidden by funding the anti-communist Contras in Nicaragua, thus creating the Iran-Contra affair. This affair caused Reagan's approval rating to decrease. Reagan, a staunch anti-communist, focused heavily on national defense, which could be seen with his SDI, or also known as Star Wars, which was Reagan's proposed missile defense system. However, he did ease Cold War tensions by communication with Premier Mikhail Gorbachev, even ordering Gorbachev to tear down the Berlin Wall. With the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 and in 1988, Reagan's vice president George Bush won the presidential election. George Bush's presidency was defined by the Gulf War. The objective of the war was to liberate Kuwait from Iraq and to protect the U.S. oil's reserves in the area. The war was easily won with no casualties. President George Bush's presidency also experienced the collapse of Soviet Union in 1991, effectively ending the Cold War. Despite these successes, Bush lost re-election to Democrat Bill Clinton. This was because of an economic recession that compromised his promise of no new taxes and the popularity of the third-party candidate Ross Perot. Now on to President Bill Clinton. He established himself as a moderate Democrat, and one of his first policies was that Don't Ask, Don't Tell bill that addressed sexual preference as a requirement to join the army, but it discriminated against servicemen and women who were open about non-straight sexual preferences. The NAFTA agreement between the United States, Mexico, and Canada about open trade and economic cooperation occurred under Clinton's presidential tenure. Clinton's budget reform helped to reduce the federal deficit through gradual income taxes while cutting federal spending. Despite his achievements, his impeachment hearings trumped these, and the House charged him of perjury and obstruction of justice in regards to testimony on his affair with the White House intern. However, he was acquitted of these charges in the Senate. Now on to President George W. Bush. He was the son of President H.W. Bush and won the presidential election of 2000. Bush faced numerous issues during his presidential tenure, such as the federal handling of Hurricane Katrina's damage, a severe economic recession called the Great Recession as a result of the 2008 housing crisis. Bush was notable for his war on terrorism, which started after the 9/11 attacks on the Freedom Towers and the Pentagon. The government, as a response, passed the USA Patriot Acts, which enabled complete surveillance of the world to combat terrorism. Bush also created the Department of the Homeland Security to prevent future terrorist attacks. He also engaged in wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, which burned down Saddam Hussein and started the demise of the Taliban and Al-Qaeda, as well as finding Osama bin Laden. Now on to President Barack Obama. President Barack Obama won the 2008 election, becoming the U.S.'s first African-American president. His presidency brought the Affordable Care Act, which is referred to the Obamacare, which intended to expand affordable and accessible healthcare access to most Americans. To address the economic recession, he passed the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act to stabilize the economy and decrease unemployment. Obama's war on terrorism was successfully defined by the killing of Osama bin Laden, as well as returning home troops from Iran and Afghanistan, which ultimately ended the longest wars in U.S. history. That is it for the episode. Obviously, more happens in the present with Trump or Biden, Hillary Clinton, but that is for future. Thank you so much for listening to our podcast series.
Thank you.
It has been one hell of a learning journey, and we thank you so much for joining Max's and Vito's A Push Journey.
A Push Journey. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Have a good